Seeger. Ress.
Here.
McInnes.
Here.
Willie. Dave.
Here.
Fitzmaurice. Crawford.
Here.
Smale. Randolph. Truxillo.
Here.
And Troncosko. Francosco?
Here.
Okay.
Very good.
All right. Public announcements, please silence all phones and electronic devices. Well, there's no appeals to this. So we'll go to public hearings, a presentation from Dana Brown and Associates regarding low-impact development guidebook.
Good evening.
You want to get started?
Oh, I'm sorry, you start, you introduce me. You can say I'm here. I thought I was supposed
All right, thank y'all, commissioners. We embarked on a project maybe about a year and a half ago, for St. Tammany Parish called Low Impact Development and Green Infrastructure. So it's just a way of how we can try and better manage our stormwater, where it falls, and we can maybe lessen the burden on our gray infrastructure, our traditional infrastructure for drainage. So we obtained a grant through the EPA and UNO Research and Technology Foundation, if I'm not mistaken. And Dana Brown was selected to put this program together. And again, we're trying to incentivize uses of green infrastructure and low impact development on development sites. So to do that, we needed a document that we can give to the public, use for ourselves, and kind of try and stop or mitigate the drainage issues that we have in St. Tammany Parish. So with that, I'll hand it over to Dana Brown. She can introduce herself and what low impact development and green infrastructure is and how we can utilize it in St. Tammany Parish. So thank you.
Thank you. You guys are so patient with me. 2 accidents on 190. I apologize. I'll learn to just be in the other lane next time. Maybe that'll do it. But thank you for having me, and I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to work on this. This is the kind of work that my firm does a lot of and has for about 18 years here in Southeast Louisiana. So first, the background of why this was important is what St. Tammany Parish is and why people want to come live here. And the main reasons is the natural environment, the forested areas, the quiet areas, the uplands, the Pleistocene terrace, if you're a geology nerd like I am, the topography. But in the last 10 years, you've had 46% population growth, and I don't have to tell you that, really. And so what does that do? Development tends to replace those things that people want to be here and enjoy, like forested areas, natural areas, the streams and rivers, the topography, habitat, things like that. But part of that natural systems is hydrology, natural hydrology. And when it's allowed to work properly, flooding, I'm not saying flooding doesn't occur, but it's certainly a lot less frequent, a lot less intense than what we've been seeing. But the other problem is our natural character here is disappearing. And we don't want that. How can we make it work and still have development? And that's what LID, low impact development, is all about. But most development increases impervious surfaces, as you know, and I'm telling you a lot of things I'm sure you know, but I just want to set that foundation. And the impervious surfaces create more runoff. It doesn't go into the ground like it naturally would. There aren't the forests intercepting the water or taking it up with their roots or in their leaves. And we have replaced that with paving all over the place, parking lots, roads, and also rooftops. So that's why all the runoff is increased. Even when we weren't having more severe storm events, the runoff was increased. Now we have that on top of it, right? So we can't control how storm events are going to occur, but they seem to be more frequent and more severe. So what does that do? That causes flooding. Low impact development is, think of it as an umbrella kind of approach to dealing with development. It's not just about reducing flood risk, but it is. So the approach to it is not just what do you do on a parcel, but what do you do on a development, or what do you think about in a parish or a city? And so you want to maximize conservation of those things we love about the parish. The forested areas, the hydrology, the topography, the wildlife habitats, the things that make it special. So if you can conserve those as much as possible, but still build, still develop, and you don't even have to give up the number of houses we're talking about. We're not even talking about that. But site planning then works with the natural systems that are there instead of against it. So I'm going to step aside slightly from my bullet points and say, think about it when a developer a lot of times gets a parcel, they sort of clear it. And they make it nice and flat, and they bring in a bunch of fill, and they think they've got a blank canvas now. They can do whatever they want. Well, no, they actually just created problems already, and they haven't even built anything because they interrupted the natural hydrology, the natural flow of water. They've interrupted how water infiltrates into the ground. They probably caused erosion that went into the streams and clogged up the streams. They've removed a lot of vegetation, did a lot of things for us in terms of air quality and water quality and cooling areas, right? So that's been our view of how to do development for generations. You know, clear it, let's have a blank slate. But instead, if we analyze what's there and we utilize what's there to do our development and plan it, and then to design it, we're using the natural hydrology as much as possible. Hopefully I'm not talking around in circles here, but, and then this is an approach, but a type of facility that helps that get implemented is green infrastructure. So I mentioned, I said low impact development is sort of the umbrella because it's about planning a site, and that means codes and things like that, right? And also what they do, but also means the design of the site, which is when you get to green infrastructure. So this just really quick little sketch I have up there, I wanted to bring up one project that was done in 1969 that did it the right way. And then we forgot. And I'm a landscape architect, so if I have any opportunity to brag about landscape architecture, I will. And it was done by a landscape architect, a famous landscape architect. And it's the original phase of the woodlands north of Houston. So the original phase, not later, the original phase of the woodlands, which people fight to buy houses in. Ian McHarg was a famous landscape architect, Scottish, heavy drinker in case you want to know. But he was called in because they wanted to develop this land, but it was actually wooded. And I should have brought pictures of it, and I apologize for not doing that, but the civil engineer took the approach we always did and figured out, here's how much it's going to cost to grade it and bring in fill, and here's how much it's going to cost to put in all the pipes and the curbs and gutters and all that kind of stuff. And it was upwards, in 1969, of $21 million. Now, this is a huge site, too. Ian McHarg came in and planned it the way landscape architects are taught to look at the world. And by the way, we don't just shrub it up. We do a lot of planning, site planning. And we look at the world more from natural system standpoint, like environmental planners do. And he planned around the natural hydrology and conserved stands of forests, not a tree here or there, but stands of forests, and clustered development, like I'm trying to illustrate poorly with this little diagram. So if you cluster development, the lots are smaller, but look what's around the lots. Not another big lot. You could have a half acre, 1 acre lot, but next to you might be another 1 acre lot where everything was cleared the way we do it now, right? But in this way, that forested area is part of the development, and that is protected, conserved in perpetuity because it's part of the drainage system. It's part of how the hydrology works and how the whole site works. And you could look right now on Google Earth and go look up it's called Grogan's Mill village, the first phase of the Woodlands, and it's hard to find the houses because they didn't take down all the trees.
Here's what I found.
Siri's trying to talk to me, sorry. No, thank you. So on each parcel, the other thing they did was they didn't even clear each residential parcel. They cleared where you had to clear to build. And that's it. And so the drainage went around, there was forests behind it, forests all around it. So people were living in what a lot of people want to think of when they move to the North Shore. They were living in a natural environment. After, I want to say it was Murchison owned it, after he sold it, the new owner just threw away that whole approach, and all the phases subsequent to that are curb and gutter, lots of paving, and lots of drainage problems. But the other upside to that was the cost of that was $6.5 million to prepare the site. A lot less grading, a lot shorter roads, fewer roads. You're not putting a road everywhere, you're putting a road and clustering around it, which is also where you're putting all the utilities, right? So lowers cost of utilities like power and water service and sewage service and the cost of the roads. All of that translates into long-term maintenance that's reduced. And it was less clearing, less grading, all those things. And people were living in a place they wanted to live. And they still fight to buy a dwelling in that part. So that's really the essence of low-impact development, right there. So you're conserving, and you're utilizing the natural systems like the hydrology that's already existing, the way the water already flows, how the soil already works. But you can also employ green infrastructure. You're already doing that here. You're building retention basins to help, because you're just like everywhere, well, not as bad as New Orleans, sorry, or Jefferson, or East Bank of Jefferson, where we have to do retrofits because everything's already paved. You're not in that place, thank goodness. Don't get there. It's very hard to then find a space to deal with water. So then you end up with big pipes and canals and pumps. So you're building the detention basins, I should say, and that is a natural way to deal with it, except you're having to build them because you're having to deal with the water that's already run off from all the development that's already occurred. But it's better retrofitting than has to be done in really urbanized areas. So that's a good thing. Let's see. So the strategy, and if I had my company t-shirt, that's what's on the back of my t-shirt, is manage stormwater where it lands. So let's think about that for a second. We've always looked at rain, stormwater. I'm going to flood, get rid of that water, get it out of here. I don't want it in my front yard. I don't want it in my driveway. I don't want it on my street. I don't want it anywhere. Get rid of it. Well, it's got to go somewhere. And it's either going to go to your neighbor, or it's going to go into a drainage system that might be a channel or a ditch, or it might be a pipe. And at some point, everybody else is dumping all their water in there at the same time, because the storm's going on. And at some point, it gets filled up. And it can't take anymore. Even Lake Pontchartrain, we think about all the rivers on the North Shore that are draining into Lake Pontchartrain, and all the canals that are pumping water on the South Shore into Lake Pontchartrain. At the same time, the tides can come in. Lake Pontchartrain can't handle it all, so there's backflooding, right, up some of the streams. So it's trying to fight nature instead of work with it. So if you can manage water where that raindrop falls, as close as possible, that's the now think about this, that's the cheapest thing you can do, and it's the most effective thing you can do. When is that true? When is that ever true? But it is, because you're not capturing it, collecting it, putting it in a pipe, conveying it somewhere else, storing it somewhere else, or disposing of it somewhere else. All those things cost money to design, to build, and maintain. So that's the big overriding stormwater management principle of low-impact development. To help with that, minimize impervious surfaces. So if we do that little cluster development, you have less roads, there's less paved areas. So there's less runoff right away. And the forests are still there, the wetlands are still there, to help manage the water. Everything does not have to go into, and Ross referred to it, gray infrastructure, which is pipes and canals and things. So minimize those impervious surfaces, and you could still do paving and do pervious paving. This little diagram just shows a parking lot where the cars park is pervious. The water goes straight down. So let's think about it. If the water goes straight down, it has a chance to infiltrate into the soil and into the groundwater. Now, you don't have the kind of clay soils we have on the South Shore, but on the South Shore, those clay soils shrink and swell. It's almost like the earth is breathing when it dries up and fills up again. And so when they don't let the water recharge into the ground, we get a lot of soil subsidence and we get foundations breaking and things like that on the South Shore. So count your blessings there. But minimize impervious surfaces so that water can infiltrate. Do you have a question? Yes.
Was asking developers and the department here to look into the pervious pavement, and the answer that came back to me was that our soil types do not perk well enough so that there's no benefit from pervious pavement. Basically, the idea was sort of not suitable unless you have a very porous soil.
Well, it's
It
not.
sounds like if you're using it in clay soils on the South Shore,
are.
we could certainly use it here.
Exactly. I got that. I'm from New Orleans, but I worked in California for 15 years and brought a lot of the ideas back. So I've been back here for a little over 20 years, and I got exactly the same thing. When I was teaching at LSU and I was living in Baton Rouge, thank goodness I'm living here now, but I got the same thing. Soil infiltration rates are too slow. It can't work. Well, there's a couple of points with that. First, underneath any kind of pervious paving, and there are many different types, you put about 12 inches of coarse aggregate rocks, like 2-inch rocks, which gives you about a 35% void space. And you're storing water under there, and the pressure of the water itself, and over time it does infiltrate into the ground and helps to prevent soil subsidence. So that's one thing if it's paving. If you have green infrastructure that's planted, if you've ever had your grandmother ask you to dig up that shrub over there because she wanted to plant something different, and that doesn't look bad, I can do that. And you're digging, and you're digging, and you're digging, and maybe she planted that 5 years ago, but the roots are way, way down there, and you're digging in clay. So those little plant roots piped down into that clay soil and brought water and nutrients and microbes. Another nerd thing if you want to stay and talk about it later. But that changes the characteristic of that soil, so the soil is more permeable. So if you have more of the plants and not everything paved, those change the characteristics of the soil and make it more permeable. Mm-hmm. But we're also about storage. Just like the detention basins you build here, well, maybe all the water's not infiltrating into the ground, but you're detaining it till that gray system has a chance to catch up with that storm protocol. But if it all just runs off right away, you're overwhelming the gray system. So you're trying to help the gray system function better and take some of the burden off of it. Did I answer you?
You did.
Okay, I want to make sure I do.
I'm going to tell them Dana Brown says
You
yes,
can tell
we
them to call me, because I've fought it for 20 years around here. I had a site in Baton Rouge that was 0.017 inches per hour was the infiltration rate. Okay. We put in pervious paving, we put in planting, and it doesn't flood. Because you're storing the water, detaining it, and then you've got the plants all around it. changing the conditions of the soils. The other thing you need to do, besides minimize impervious surfaces, is introduce more native vegetation, native plants, particularly native trees, but any native plants, not introduced plants. You know, the azaleas normally, that's not native. Crepe myrtles are not native. And the reason, and I love those plants. And so, but if you use, and we seem to use almost all non-natives, we're not taking advantage of what the native plants can do. And one of the things that they do is they put roots really deep into the soil, about 3 times the depth of a same plant planted at the same time that's non-native. And again, what does that do? Helps water get down into the ground. But think about this summer when it didn't rain, those plants with the deep roots can maybe find some water way down there. But the ones with more shallow roots may have had to be watered, has to be irrigated, or they die. So if we keep thinking of back to nature, work with nature, mimic nature, really is what we're trying to do with low-impact development. That includes native plants as much as possible. You want to minimize grading. So we help them with that in Tammany Parish, where there's a maximum amount of cut and a maximum amount of fill you can do anywhere, any elevation at all. 2 feet. You could cut 2 feet, you could fill 2 feet, that's it. Can't fill in a floodplain at all. And there are ways to design that, and people have been designing it like that in other places. We're doing what we're used to doing, what we know to do, and so we have to sort of learn a little bit differently if we want to save the environment that we all love here. Maximize the cluster kind of development so that you don't have just sprawl everywhere and paving everywhere. And conserve those natural green spaces so that they're part of the development. So if I have a 100-acre subdivision, would they only be that small, but they're bigger than that usually, right? A 100-acre subdivision, and I could still put the same number of houses, but some of that land is not developed. It's kept natural. It may even be wetlands. I keep looking at the when I say the word wetlands. Can't help it. But that land is conserved as part of that development. You can't come back later and develop that. And guess what? You can also reduce the size or even sometimes the need for detention basins in those developments. And the detention basins I normally see everywhere is this ugly square thing, rectangular thing, over in a corner with steep side slopes and a lot of times a fence around it. So you took that land out of commerce, made it ugly, made it not function that well, but it only has one function, and you don't have to do it that way. Does that make sense? You guys please holler at me if I'm, not quite making sense. I have been accused of that. So. Yeah, I mean, for low-impact development, if you have to have a detention or retention basin, put it in the middle of the development and make it a feature. Have gentler side slopes and plant it with native plants, maybe even make it a little fishing pond, or have it just be detention where there's never standing water in it, but kids could go play in that flat area at the bottom when it's dry. But make it a feature in the middle of the site instead of over there in the corner. That's what we do when we plan projects like this. We planned one in Calcasieu Parish that was 2,000 acres, and we were able to plant it, and they don't have trees, it was all cane fields and rice fields, so it wasn't any forest. Weren't any native prairies left either, but we were able to use detention ponds, detention/retention, so the freeboard was what we used to take care of stormwater, and we could handle the 100-year storm of that by designing it that way. And it wasn't a thing over in the corner. So the benefits are reduced flood risk. I will never tell you I'm going to reduce flooding, because I don't think anybody could say that anymore, but I can reduce the risk Because I could say I'm reducing flooding from the storm that just happened, and tomorrow there's a bigger one. So it's reducing flood risk, and that's what you're trying to do, which helps a lot with the community rating system and insurance and other things in the community. Recharges groundwater, we talked about that. It also improves water quality. So all this water ends up in Lake Pontchartrain, and they spent many years cleaning up Lake Pontchartrain because of all the shell dredging. But there's still a lot of not nice stuff that gets, that runs off the pavement and the rooftops. Bacteria, lead, all kinds of heavy metals, phosphorus, people who over-fertilize golf courses and their front yards, all that ends up in there. But if you can put it through green infrastructure first, you can take a lot of those pollutants out before it ever ends up in Lake Pontchartrain. So that's improving water quality. Plants, particularly trees, improve air quality significantly. And they not only sequester carbon, but they take particulate matter out of the air and other kinds of pollutants that are in the air, so you're not breathing it. A huge thing for areas like ours where we have people with a lot of respiratory diseases and heart diseases and elderly people, it becomes a public health issue, in my opinion. The vegetation, the plant, you know it, right? You could walk out in a parking lot and then walk right under a forest. It's like, wow, that's 10 degrees cooler. It's called the urban heat island effect, where it's more paved, that area never cools off. At night, it never cools off, not enough. And so then it just heats up some more faster the next day. So you just build up heat. But if you have a lot of trees and even shrubs and lower kinds of plants, it actually uses evapotranspiration, remember that from 7th grade or something, science, 7th grade science, and cools the air. So that helps to reduce that. The populations are healthier because of air quality and water quality and reduced flood risk. And I contend if you've got more trees, particularly on walkways, people will walk a little bit, because who's going to walk around here in August if there's not a single tree anywhere? I have to drive my car to a park to walk, which is sort of crazy. You're conserving natural habitats that are really important to us. I think we're learning more and more about how would we destroy them, how they impact us and our food chain, our own food chain. There's the economic cost savings I talked about earlier. It actually generates economic activity because people want to live in those places, or they want to open businesses in those places. I mean, I'll give you one example. It's just the North Shore, how you deal with signs. And then we don't see those giant signs up on poles, and they're monument signs. They're slow. That has a huge effect on the visual quality of just being in the community. Well, having trees and vegetation, all those things does the same. And improves environmental equity, because this works for everybody, but it improves the quality of life for everybody. And that was it.
Perfect timing. 6 o'clock.
Okay. Did I? Okay, good. I'm happy to answer questions, or if you send stuff to Ross.
Yeah, I know we're kind of delayed on getting
I'll answer
started.
any-
So we kind of went through a little quicker than we normally would have, but I mean, if Dana's here and somebody has some questions, that's up to the chairman, however you want to handle it.
And I'd be happy to come back anytime. And I'll helicopter in so I get here.
Well, I think there, over the years, I've been around too long, but over the years, we started out with a police jury system of government. And then we finally got to a parish council form of government. And I guess I was one of the first police jurors that started with some retention along major commercial buildings, development. And it did help, although it was only a 10% factor at that time. We're up to 25, and maybe we need to go to 35. I don't know. But I'm not an engineer, but that lady sitting out there is an engineer. And she can sure tell me if we need, through the council, to increase that from a 25% to a 35%, or whatever the number is. But we still have developers that for some reason, they love wetlands, they like to build in wetlands, but they think that they can fill the lots and stuff, so they quote-unquote don't flood. But I've seen pictures over here on the west part of St. Tammany, what was it, 2 years ago, I think? Well, we had one of these frog croakers come in, and they couldn't get out of their driveway because the streets were flooded. And it took a while for it to go down.
Yes, sir.
And to me, that's not building a subdivision correctly. But I don't know all the ins and outs, but that's what we've got, some good folks on staff. And, you know, we'll go from there. If any of the other commissioners want to make a comment, just come on the queue and we'll plug you in.
I just wanted to say that I think that was the whole goal of the PUD concept a few years back, was the cluster development and more green space. But in reality, it hasn't turned out that way. I'm not sure why. But in reality, the whole thing, it's either homes or detention ponds and very little else. And we need to get back to that original concept of having the clustered trees of undeveloped to go along with it.
So, Ross, what's the outcome of this? It's a handbook? Is it a development handbook?
Yeah, right now, it's a handbook, and it's just to have staff start beginning to think as we're in a rewrite process, what strategies are good for the code and what strategies are good as a policy, and how they can be used in either commercial or residential developments, and how we can incentivize developers to look at it. The commission, sitting as the zoning commission, you know, we had an AML zoning classification that we have amended lately, and that amendment had one additional feature to it, and it's a geotechnical report, or it's a report from an engineer for the feasibility of low-impact development, green infrastructure on an AML site. So we know an AML site can have a building footprint up to 1 million square feet. And that's fine. But how can we, you know, maybe manage the stormwater risk a little bit better on site rather than our overburdened infrastructure that, you know, we currently have, that we're working to improve, you know, every day. But it's just a different strategy that we can present to, you know, specifically in the AML zoning classification right now, because that's a requirement. But then moving forward, how can we incentivize developers to potentially use green infrastructure and low-impact development? You know, right now we can't commingle, let's call it, our buffers with landscape and drainage. And correct me if I'm wrong at any time, Ted. But maybe in the future, we should be able to do that. Maybe we want to put our native plants and our drainage infrastructure in one area. Then therefore, you have more area to develop, you know? So that's the incentive part of it. So you can cluster your drainage and your plantings in one area rather than have them separated, and that opens up more land for development. So it's something that we're just looking at right now, but it's something that needs to be looked at. So this is the beginning stage of it. For us, Dana's part of it is ending, but it's just the beginning for St. Tammany Parish as far as low-impact development and green infrastructure is concerned.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Okay, does anyone else want to present a question to Ross or Ms. Brown? Well, then we'll request an adjournment of this meeting, and then we'll start the other one in just a few minutes.
Thank you, Commission. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you very much.